in the glittering ballrooms of Boston's elite society during the roaring 20s, where champagne flowed like water and fortunes were made overnight, there lived a woman who had everything money could buy but nothing her heart truly wanted. Isabella Hayes possessed beauty that could silence a room, intelligence that intimidated Harvard professors, and a railroad fortune that made grown men weep with envy. Yet night after night, she stood in her family's marble mansion, rejecting one wealthy suitor after another with a cold precision that had earned her the whispered title of the Ice Queen of Beacon Hill. But what happened when a simple mountain man from Colorado spoke just one word to her would change everything she thought she knew about love, worth, and the price of a life lived for others' expectations? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Hayes Mansion stood like a monument to American ambition. On the most prestigious street in Boston, its limestone facade gleaming under the electric streetlights that had only recently replaced the old gas lamps. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across walls lined with oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors who had built their empire one railroad tie at a time. The year was 1926, and prosperity painted the city gold, but for Isabella Hayes, wealth felt more like a gilded cage than a blessing. Isabella had been raised to be perfect, and by every measure society could devise, she had succeeded magnificently. At 24, she spoke 4 languages fluently, could discuss philosophy with visiting professors from Harvard, played piano with the skill of a concert virtuoso, and managed the charitable endeavors of 3 different women's organizations. Her auburn hair caught light like burnished copper, her emerald eyes held depths that made poets stumble over their words, and when she entered a room wearing one of her custom gowns from Paris, conversation stopped mid-sentence. But perfection, Isabella had learned, was a lonely summit to occupy. Every morning, she woke in her silk-draped bedroom overlooking the Charles River and felt the weight of expectations pressing down like a physical thing. Her mother, Margaret Hayes, had spent years orchestrating Isabella's life with the precision of a military campaign, ensuring that every moment served the greater purpose of securing an advantageous marriage that would unite 2 great fortunes and cement the Hayes legacy for generations to come. The parlor had become Isabella's battlefield, where she met an endless parade of suitors who arrived with practiced smiles and calculated charm. There was William Ashworth III, whose family owned half the textile mills in New England, who spoke to her about profit margins while barely glancing at her face. There was Charles Vanderbilt Montgomery, a distant cousin of the famous family, who spent their entire tea conversation discussing his collection of rare automobiles as if she were simply another acquisition to be cataloged. Each man came armed with impressive credentials, sterling bloodlines, and the absolute certainty that Isabella Hayes would be grateful for the honor of their attention. She rejected them all with a polite coldness that had become her signature defense. "Thank you for your interest, Mr. Ashworth, but I'm afraid we wouldn't suit," she would say, her voice carrying the finality of a judge's gavel when pressed. For reasons she offered none, simply rising gracefully from her chair and gliding from the room with her spine straight and her head high, leaving bewildered men to wonder what they had done wrong. The truth was, they had done nothing wrong beyond the cardinal sin of seeing her as a prize to be won rather than a person to be known. They spoke of her beauty, but never asked about her thoughts. They praised her accomplishments, but showed no interest in her dreams. They calculated her dowry, but never wondered about her hopes, her fears, or what made her laugh until tears sparkled in her eyes. To them, she was Isabella Hayes, heiress and ornament, a lovely addition to their social standing and financial portfolios. Margaret Hayes grew increasingly frustrated with her daughter's stubbornness. "Isabella, darling, you cannot continue this ridiculous charade," she would say during their daily meetings in the morning room, her voice carrying the sharp edge of aristocratic displeasure. The Pemberton boy is from one of the finest families in New York, and his intentions are entirely honorable. What more could you possibly want? But Isabella had learned that honorable intentions and genuine affection were entirely different creatures, and she was no longer willing to settle for one while starving for the other. The servants whispered about her in the corridors, their voices carrying a mixture of admiration and concern. Old Samuel Jenkins, the family butler who had served the Hayes household for 30 years, watched Isabella with paternal worry. He had seen her grow from a spirited child who climbed trees in her petticoats into this poised but increasingly isolated young woman, and he recognized the sadness that lived behind her polished smile. "Miss Isabella carries herself like a queen," he would tell the younger staff. But even queens need someone to see them as more than a crown. Boston society buzzed with speculation about Isabella's rejections. At charity luncheons and theater, jealous, the city's most prominent women debated her motives with the intensity usually reserved for political scandals. Some whispered that she was too proud, setting her standards impossibly high because she believed herself superior to every available gentleman. Others suggested she harbored secret romantic attachments, perhaps to some inappropriate figure who could never meet her family's approval. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The most charitable assumed she was simply taking her time, carefully evaluating her options before making the momentous decision that would shape the rest of her life. But Isabella knew her own heart better than the gossips ever could, and the truth was both simpler and more complex than any of their theories. She was waiting for something none of the men in her parlor had ever offered her: the recognition that she was more than the sum of her family's accomplishments and her trust fund's value. She wanted to be seen, truly seen, by someone who cared more about the thoughts in her head than the jewels around her neck. The turning point came on a particularly difficult evening when Richard Pemberton arrived for what Margaret had orchestrated as the most important courtship of the season. Pemberton was everything the Hayes family could want in a son-in-law: wealthy beyond measure, connected to New York's most influential circles, handsome in the clean-cut way that graced magazine covers, and utterly convinced of his own irresistibility. He swept into their drawing room wearing a tailored evening coat that cost more than most families earned in a year, carrying himself with the confident swagger of a man who had never been denied anything he truly wanted. "Miss Hayes," he said, taking her gloved hand and holding it longer than propriety dictated, "I've heard so much about your selectiveness. I confess it only increases my interest. A woman of discernment is a rare treasure in these modern times." His smile was practiced perfection, his words carefully chosen to demonstrate both his persistence and his confidence that he would succeed where others had failed. Isabella felt something cold settle in her chest as she recognized the calculation behind his charm. Here was a man who saw her rejections not as expressions of her autonomy, but as challenges to be overcome, puzzles to be solved through the application of sufficient wealth and social pressure. When he spoke about their potential future together, he described it in terms of merging empires and creating legacies, as if she were a business proposition rather than a flesh-and-blood woman with her own desires and dreams. "I believe, Miss Hayes, that what you've been searching for is a man of substance, someone who can match your family's prominence while offering you the respect due a woman of your station," Pemberton continued, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through sheer persistence. "I can offer you homes in New York, Newport, and Palm Beach, a position at the center of society that befits your breeding, and children who will inherit the finest bloodlines in America." As he spoke, Isabella felt the familiar weight of expectations settling around her shoulders like a heavy cloak. This was what everyone wanted for her, what they had been grooming her toward since childhood: a marriage that would be celebrated in all the society papers, a union that would be discussed in boardrooms and drawing rooms as a masterpiece of strategic alliance. But listening to Pemberton describe their hypothetical life together, she realized with crystalline clarity that nowhere in his vision was there room for Isabella the person, only Isabella the symbol, the beautiful, accomplished wife who would grace his arm at important functions and bear his properly pedigreed children. The rejection, when it came, surprised even Isabella with its finality. "Mr. Pemberton," she said, her voice carrying a new edge of steel that made him pause mid-sentence, "I thank you for your interest, but I must decline your suit. We would not suit at all." The words came out colder than she had intended. But she found she did not care. She was tired of softening her refusals to spare the feelings of men who had never bothered to consider hers. Pemberton's confident smile faltered for the first time that evening. "Miss Hayes, perhaps you misunderstood my intentions. I'm offering you marriage, a position that any sensible woman would consider the pinnacle of good fortune." His voice carried a note of incredulous anger, as if her refusal were a personal insult rather than the exercise of her own free will. "I understood perfectly," Isabella replied, rising from her chair with the grace that had been drilled into her since childhood, "and my answer remains unchanged. Good evening, Mr. Pemberton." She walked toward the door, her silk gown rustling softly against the marble floor, but his voice stopped her before she could make her escape. "You're making a grave mistake, Miss Hayes," he called after her, his polite mask finally slipping to reveal the entitled fury beneath. "Do you think you can continue this charade indefinitely? You're 24 years old, hardly a young girl anymore. Your options will only grow more limited with each passing season, and eventually you'll find yourself grateful for whatever offer comes your way, no matter how modest." The words hit Isabella like physical blows, not because she believed them, but because they voiced the fears that whispered to her in the dark hours before dawn. She was acutely aware of the passage of time, of the way society viewed unmarried women past their supposed prime, of the gradual shift from being courted as a prize to being pitied as a spinster. But even facing that possibility, she could not bring herself to settle for a life that would slowly suffocate her spirit. That night, Isabella stood at her bedroom window overlooking the gaslit streets of Boston, watching the late carriages and early automobiles navigate the cobblestones. Below, the city stretched out before her like a glittering web of possibilities and limitations, beautiful and constraining in equal measure. She pressed her palm against the cold glass and wondered if this was all there was, an endless parade of suitable men who saw her as a beautiful object to be acquired, a life lived according to other people's expectations, a future that had been planned for her before she was old enough to voice her own desires. The thought that changed everything came to her in the quiet darkness of her room, simple and revolutionary in its honesty. She didn't have to accept any of it. The realization settled over her like dawn breaking, bringing with it both terror and exhilaration. She had money of her own, held in trust but legally hers to control. She had intelligence, education, and skills that could serve her well beyond the drawing rooms of Beacon Hill. She had, for the first time in her adult life, the possibility of choice. The decision, when it finally crystallized, felt both impulsive and inevitable. Isabella would leave Boston, leave the suffocating expectations and the endless parade of calculating suitors, and find somewhere she could discover who she truly was when stripped of her family name and social position. She would go west, where the country was still wild enough that a woman might reinvent herself, where her identity could be something more than the sum of her inheritance and her marriageability. The planning took weeks of careful secrecy. Isabella withdrew funds from her personal account, arranged for transportation, and packed only what she could carry in a few carefully chosen trunks. She left letters for her mother and Samuel Jenkins, trying to explain what could not really be explained, that she needed to find herself before she could give herself to anyone else, that she was choosing uncertainty over a certainty that felt like death. On a crisp October morning when the maple leaves along Commonwealth Avenue blazed red and gold, Isabella Hayes walked out of her family's mansion carrying nothing but a small valise and a heart full of terrified hope. She had purchased a ticket on the westbound train, destination Colorado, drawn by descriptions of mountain air so clean it could wash away old identities and valleys where a person could disappear into anonymity and possibility. As the train pulled away from Boston South Station, Isabella pressed her face to the window and watched her familiar world shrink into the distance. The city that had shaped her, constrained her, and ultimately failed to satisfy the deepest longings of her heart grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, leaving only the vast American landscape rolling past her window like an unwritten page waiting for her story. She was no longer Isabella Hayes, heiress and ice queen of Beacon Hill. She was simply Isabella, a young woman with auburn hair and emerald eyes, traveling toward a future she could not predict but had finally claimed as her own. The mountains of Colorado waited ahead, holding secrets she had never imagined, and a love that would teach her the difference between being desired and being truly seen. The train wheezed to a halt at Pine Ridge Station with a final exhausted sigh of steam and metal, as if it too was weary from the long journey across America's heartland. Isabella stepped onto the wooden platform, clutching her leather valise, the mountain air hitting her lungs like a shock of cold water. After 3 days of travel through increasingly wild landscape, she had finally reached the end of the railroad line, a place so remote it seemed to exist on the very edge of civilization itself. Pine Ridge bore no resemblance to any town Isabella had ever known. Where Boston's streets were paved with cobblestones and lined with stately brownstones, Pine Ridge consisted of perhaps 20 wooden buildings scattered along a single dirt road that disappeared into the towering pine forests on either side. The train station was little more than a weathered shed with a hand-painted sign, and the platform where Isabella stood was made of rough-hewn planks that creaked ominously under her fashionable traveling boots. The other passengers who disembarked were a motley collection of miners, loggers, and homesteaders, their faces weathered by sun and wind, their clothes practical and well-worn. They glanced at Isabella with undisguised curiosity, taking in her tailored traveling dress, her perfectly arranged hair, and the quality leather of her luggage. She might as well have stepped off the train wearing a tiara and ermine robes for all the attention her obvious wealth attracted in this hardscrabble mountain community. As the train pulled away with a mournful whistle that echoed off the surrounding peaks, Isabella found herself standing alone on the platform, suddenly aware of how thoroughly she had severed herself from everything familiar. The silence was profound in a way that city dwellers never experienced, broken only by the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. For a moment, panic fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird. What had she done? What madness had possessed her to abandon comfort and security for this wilderness, where she knew no one and had no connections to ease her way? But the moment passed, replaced by something stronger, determination. She had not come this far to retreat at the first sign of difficulty. Isabella straightened her shoulders, picked up her valise, and walked toward the town's main street with the same poise that had carried her through countless Boston social gatherings, even though her heart hammered against her ribs with uncertainty. The first challenge came immediately. Pine Ridge boasted exactly one hotel, a 2-story wooden structure called the Mountain View Inn that had seen better decades. The lobby was cramped and dark, furnished with mismatched chairs and a registration desk that looked like it had been cobbled together from old barnwood. Behind the desk sat a man whose suspicious eyes tracked Isabella's every movement as she approached. "Need a room," she said, trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. The desk clerk looked her up and down with undisguised skepticism. "This ain't the Palmer House in Chicago, miss. Accommodations here are simple. Don't reckon you're the type for simple." Isabella met his gaze steadily. "I'll manage. How much for a week? $5 paid in advance. No meals included, no maid service. And if you're looking for hot baths every day, you'll be disappointed. We heat water once a week on Saturdays. The price was a fraction of what she would pay for a night at Boston's finest hotels. But Isabella sensed this was a test of some kind. She counted out the money without flinching and signed the register with her first small rebellion, Isabella Mitchell, giving herself a common surname that belonged to no prominent family. The room was indeed simple, containing a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over the town's main street toward the mountains beyond. The wallpaper was faded, the floorboards creaked with every step, and the mattress felt like it had been stuffed with pine needles. But it was hers, paid for with her own money, chosen by her own will, and that made it more precious than any of the luxurious suites she had occupied during family travels. Isabella unpacked her few belongings and faced her next challenge: food. In Boston, meals appeared as if by magic, prepared by skilled cooks and served by attentive staff. Here, she would need to fend for herself. The hotel clerk had mentioned Murphy's Bakery with a grudging admission that Rose makes decent bread. So Isabella ventured out to explore her new temporary home. Pine Ridge's Main Street was a study in functional simplicity. There was Crawford's General Store, advertising everything from flour to firearms in painted letters across its false front. Murphy's Bakery occupied a narrow storefront between a barber shop and what appeared to be a combination saloon and gambling hall. The bakery windows were fogged with steam, and the smell of fresh bread drifted into the street like an invitation. Isabella pushed open the door and was immediately enveloped in warmth scented with yeast, cinnamon, and something indefinably comforting. Behind the counter stood a woman perhaps 40 years old, her brown hair escaping from a practical bun, her apron dusted with flour, her face kind but marked by the sort of lines that came from hard work and mountain weather. "Well now," the woman said, looking up from a tray of rolls, "you must be the lady who came in on today's train. I'm Rose Murphy, and I guess you're about as far from home as a person can get." There was no judgment in Rose's voice, only a matter-of-fact observation delivered with the directness that seemed to characterize mountain people. Isabella found herself smiling genuinely for the first time since leaving Boston. Isabella Mitchell. And you're quite right about being far from home. Running from something or running to something? Rose asked as she wrapped a loaf of bread in brown paper. Not that it's any of my business, but we don't get many ladies in traveling dresses stopping off in Pine Ridge. Most folks who come here are looking for work in the mines or the logging camps. Isabella considered the question. Seriously, both, I think. Definitely running from something. As for what I'm running to, I suppose I'll find out. Rose nodded as if this made perfect sense. Fair enough. Word of advice, though. That dress is going to mark you as an outsider every place you go. Folks here aren't unfriendly, but they're wary of anything that smells like money or privilege. Too many mining companies and railroad barons have taken advantage over the years. The warning proved prescient. Over the following days, Isabella discovered that her wealth, which had been a burden in Boston society, was an even greater obstacle in Pine Ridge. The townspeople treated her with polite distance, helpful enough when she needed directions or supplies, but clearly viewing her as a temporary curiosity rather than someone who might belong among them. At Crawford's General Store, Daniel Crawford sold her provisions with professional courtesy, but little warmth. When she asked about the possibility of renting a small cabin instead of staying at the hotel indefinitely, he mentioned a few options, but made it clear he doubted her ability to manage the isolation and practical demands of mountain living. "Winter comes early and hard up here, miss. Folks who aren't prepared don't generally make it through their first season." Isabella began to understand that her challenge wasn't simply finding a place to live, but proving she deserved to belong in a community that valued self-reliance above all else. These people had carved lives from unforgiving wilderness through sheer determination and mutual support. They had no use for someone who might prove to be a burden or who would abandon them when life became difficult. Determined to prove herself, Isabella began looking for ways to contribute. She offered to help Rose at the bakery, but her attempts at kneading dough and managing the temperamental wood-fired ovens were clumsy disasters that probably cost Rose more in wasted ingredients than they helped. She tried to assist at the general store, but her ignorance of frontier necessities made her more hindrance than help when customers needed advice about which supplies would best serve their needs. The failures stung, but they also taught Isabella something valuable about herself. In Boston, her worth had been measured by her family's achievements and her ability to ornament social gatherings. Here, value was determined by what you could do with your own hands, how much others could depend on you when times got hard, and whether you would still be standing when the storms came. As autumn deepened into October, Isabella rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town, a one-room structure with a stone fireplace, a hand pump well, and windows that framed spectacular views of the surrounding peaks. The isolation was both terrifying and liberating. For the first time in her adult life, she was truly alone, responsible for every aspect of her survival, answerable to no one but herself. The learning curve was steep and often humbling. She burned more meals than she successfully cooked, struggled to keep the fire going through cold mountain nights, and discovered that hauling water from the well and splitting kindling were far more exhausting than they appeared. Her hands, once soft and carefully manicured, developed calluses and small scars. Her fashionable dresses gave way to practical skirts and blouses that could withstand the demands of daily survival. But gradually something remarkable began to happen. As Isabella learned to manage the practical demands of mountain life, she also began to discover parts of herself that had been buried under years of social expectations. She found satisfaction in successfully preparing a simple meal, pride in maintaining her small home, and a deep peace in the silence of mountain evenings when she could sit by her fire and read by lamplight without anyone expecting her to be charming or accomplished or anything other than herself. The townspeople began to view her differently as well. When she appeared in Crawford's store wearing a practical wool skirt and sturdy boots, her questions about winter preparations were taken more seriously. When she offered to help Rose with the bakery's books, bringing to bear the mathematical skills she had learned from managing charitable organizations in Boston, Rose accepted gratefully and began including her in the casual conversations that were the lifeblood of small town social networks. It was during one of these conversations that Isabella first heard about Thomas Mitchell. Rose mentioned him casually while they worked together preparing the day's bread, describing him as Tom, the guide who lives up on Eagle Ridge, in the same tone she might use to identify any other local resident. But something in her voice suggested there was more to the story. He's been up there alone for nigh on 3 years now, Rose continued, shaping dough with practiced efficiency. Came back from the war different, like so many of them did. Folks tried to include him, invite him to town gatherings and such, but he keeps to himself mostly. Takes folks hunting or helps them find good fishing spots when they ask, but otherwise you barely see him except when he comes down for supplies. Isabella found herself curious about this solitary figure who had chosen isolation even more complete than her own. Was he from Pine Ridge originally? No, came here after he got back from France. Some say he was an officer, others claim he was just regular infantry, but nobody knows for sure. He doesn't talk about the war, and around here, we've learned not to push folks on things they'd rather keep private. Rose paused in her work to look directly at Isabella. Funny thing, though. He came in for supplies last week and asked about you. Not nozzly, mind you, just wanted to know if you were settling in all right. The comment stayed with Isabella long after their conversation ended. She found herself wondering about this mysterious mountain man who lived alone on Eagle Ridge, curious about what had driven him to seek solitude and what kind of person chose such complete isolation from human company. In Boston she had been surrounded by people constantly, but had felt profoundly alone. Here in the mountains, physical solitude had brought her closer to understanding herself, but she was beginning to recognize that there might be a difference between chosen solitude and self-imposed exile. Winter's approach became more evident each day. The aspen leaves turned brilliant gold and fell, leaving the mountainsides etched in stark beauty. The morning frost lingered longer, and the peaks that surrounded Pine Ridge began collecting caps of snow that crept steadily downward toward the valley floor. Daniel Crawford began warning customers about the necessity of laying in adequate supplies before the heavy snows made travel impossible, and Rose increased her baking schedule to provide extra bread for families stocking their pantries against the long months ahead. It was during one of these preparation trips to Crawford's store that Isabella's carefully constructed new life encountered its first serious challenge. She was examining wool blankets, trying to determine how many she would need to keep her cabin warm through a mountain winter, when she heard a familiar voice that made her blood freeze in her veins. "I'm looking for a young woman who would have arrived here within the last month or two. Auburn hair, green eyes, traveling alone. She might be using a different name, but she would stand out in a place like this." Isabella didn't need to turn around to know that Richard Pemberton had somehow tracked her to Pine Ridge. His cultured Boston accent was unmistakable among the mountain drawls and western inflections of the local customers. She kept her back, turned, hoping desperately that he wouldn't notice her. But Pine Ridge was too small a town for anonymity, and her distinctive hair color made concealment impossible. "Isabella Hayes." Pemberton's voice carried triumph and something darker as he spotted her among the blankets. "Or should I say Mitchell, according to the hotel register. How delightfully rustic of you to adopt a common surname." She turned, slowly, drawing on every lesson in composure her mother had drilled into her, and faced the man whose proposal had been the final catalyst for her flight from Boston. Pemberton looked entirely out of place in Crawford's store, his expensive traveling clothes and polished boots marking him as clearly as if he wore a sign announcing his wealth and urban origins. But his eyes held the same calculating possessiveness that had driven her to reject him, now sharpened by what appeared to be genuine anger. "Mr. Pemberton," she said calmly, though her heart raced with something between fear and fury. "What an unexpected surprise. I hadn't realized you were planning a tour of Colorado's mining communities. Don't be flippant with me, Isabella. Your mother is beside herself with worry. Do you have any idea what your disappearance has done to your family's reputation? The speculation, the gossip, the damage to carefully cultivated relationships?" Pemberton stepped closer, lowering his voice but not the intensity of his displeasure. "This childish rebellion has gone on long enough. You'll come back to Boston. With me, we'll announce our engagement, and this entire unfortunate episode will be forgotten." The presumption in his words took Isabella's breath away. Even here, hundreds of miles from the world that had shaped both of them, Pemberton assumed he had the right to direct her choices and command her compliance. She realized that geography alone would never be enough to escape the expectations that had bound her. She would have to actively reject them, no matter how uncomfortable the confrontation. "I'm afraid that's impossible, Mr. Pemberton," she said, her voice carrying a steel that surprised them both. "I have no intention of returning to Boston, and I certainly have no intention of marrying you. I thought I had made that sufficiently clear during our last conversation." Pemberton's face darkened with frustrated anger. "You think you can simply run away from your responsibilities, your family, your social position? You think you can play at being a common frontier woman indefinitely? Look around you, Isabella. This isn't some romantic adventure from a dime novel. This is poverty, hardship, and isolation. How long do you really think you can sustain this charade?" Before Isabella could respond, a new voice entered the conversation. Quiet but carrying an unmistakable authority that made both Isabella and Pemberton turn toward its source. "Seems like the lady has made her position pretty clear, friend. Might be time to respect her wishes." The man who had spoken stood near the store's entrance, having entered so quietly that neither Isabella nor Pemberton had noticed his arrival. He was tall and lean, wearing clothes that marked him as a man who worked outdoors, worn denim, a flannel shirt, boots that had seen serious use. His dark hair needed cutting, and several days' worth of beard shadowed his jaw. But it was his eyes that caught Isabella's attention, gray as storm clouds and holding a depth that spoke of experiences beyond what his apparent age should have allowed. This had to be Thomas Mitchell, the solitary guide who lived on Eagle Ridge. Isabella felt something shift in the air around them, as if the very quality of silence had changed with his presence. He moved with the easy confidence of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. But there was something else there too. A watchfulness that suggested he was accustomed to evaluating threats and responding accordingly. Pemberton drew himself up to his full height, clearly intending to assert his social superiority over this common mountain man. "This is a private conversation between myself and Miss Hayes. I suggest you mind your own business." Tom's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness became more pronounced. When a man starts raising his voice to a woman in Dan Crawford's store, it becomes everybody's business pretty quick. Around here, we believe in treating folks with respect, especially ladies who've made it clear they'd rather be left alone. The confrontation stretched taut between the two men, and Isabella realized she was witnessing something she had never seen in Boston's civilized drawing rooms. A direct challenge to male authority based not on social position or wealth, but on fundamental questions of right and wrong. Pemberton clearly expected his obvious refinement and expensive clothes to intimidate this rough mountain man, but Tom seemed entirely unimpressed by displays of urban sophistication. "I don't believe you understand the situation," Pemberton said, his voice taking on the condescending tone he might use with a servant. "Miss Hayes is from a prominent Boston family, and her presence here is the result of a temporary misunderstanding. I'm here to escort her home where she belongs." Tom's gray eyes shifted to Isabella, and for the first time since entering the store, he spoke directly to her. "That how you see it, miss? You looking to go back to Boston with this gentleman?" The question was simple, but Isabella heard layers of meaning beneath it. Tom wasn't asking about her travel plans. He was asking whether she had found what she was looking for in Pine Ridge, whether she was ready to abandon the independence she had fought so hard to claim, whether the comfort and security of her old life was worth the price of her autonomy. "No," she said, and the word came out stronger than she had expected. "I'm not going anywhere with Mr. Pemberton. I've made a life here, and I intend to keep it." Tom nodded once, as if her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. Then he turned back to Pemberton with the same calm authority he had displayed throughout the encounter. "Seems like that settles things, friend. The lady's made her choice, and it's not you. Might be best if you caught the next train back east." Pemberton's face flushed with humiliation and rage. He was accustomed to getting his way through persistence, social pressure, and the leveraging of connections, but none of those tools were available to him in Pine Ridge's egalitarian community. Here, his wealth and family name meant nothing, and his attempts at intimidation had been quietly but firmly rebuffed by a man who clearly had no interest in being impressed by urban sophistication. "This isn't over, Isabella," Pemberton said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Your family will not allow this foolishness to continue indefinitely. You may think you've found some romantic refuge in this godforsaken wilderness, but reality has a way of intruding on fantasy. When winter comes, when you're cold and hungry and alone, you'll remember what you threw away for this ridiculous adventure." He turned and stalked out of the store, leaving Isabella and Tom standing in the sudden quiet that followed his dramatic exit. Isabella felt shaky with reaction, adrenaline making her hands tremble as the full implications of the confrontation sank in. Pemberton's appearance meant that her family knew where she was, that her carefully constructed new identity was compromised, and that the peace she had found in Pine Ridge might be more fragile than she had realized. Tom seemed to sense her distress without her having to voice it. "You all right, miss?" he asked, his voice gentler than it had been when addressing Pemberton. Isabella looked up at him, really seeing him for the first time. There were lines around his eyes that suggested both laughter and sorrow, and something in his expression reminded her of veterans she had met through her charitable work in Boston, men who had seen too much but had learned to carry their burdens with quiet dignity. "I think so," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure. "Thank you for intervening." "You didn't have to do that." Tom shrugged, the gesture somehow managing to convey both dismissal and acknowledgement. "Around here, folks look out for each other. Besides, any fool could see that fellow wasn't going to take no for an answer without some encouragement." There was something in his matter-of-fact response that steadied Isabella's nerves. In Boston, such a confrontation would have generated weeks of social drama, with everyone taking sides and analyzing every word and gesture for hidden meanings. Here, Tom treated it as simply a problem that had needed solving, nothing more complicated than helping a neighbor fix a broken fence or lending a hand during harvest time. "I'm Isabella," she said, extending her hand in a gesture that felt both formal and somehow necessary. "Isabella Mitchell." Tom took her hand briefly, his calloused palm warm against her smooth skin. "Tom Mitchell. Pleased to meet you properly." "Miss Mitchell. Been hearing you're settling in well with Rose and the others." The shared surname struck Isabella as oddly significant, though she couldn't say exactly why. Perhaps it was simply that in choosing her false name, she had somehow selected one that connected her, however artificially, to the first person in Pine Ridge who had treated her with uncomplicated kindness and respect. "I'm trying to settle in," she said. "Some days are more successful than others." Tom's gray eyes held a hint of something that might have been amusement. "That's about the best any of us can manage, I reckon. Mountains have a way of teaching patience, whether you think you need the lesson or not." Before Isabella could respond, Daniel Crawford appeared from the back room where he had presumably been giving the confrontation time to resolve itself. "Everything all right out here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Just fine, Dan," Tom replied. "Miss Mitchell was shopping for winter supplies, and I thought I might offer some advice about what works best up in the higher elevations." It was a graceful way to transition from the drama of Pemberton's appearance to the practical business of preparing for winter, and Isabella felt grateful for Tom's tact. She spent the next hour learning about the realities of mountain winters from someone who clearly understood them intimately, and by the time she left Crawford's store, her cabin was provisioned for the months ahead and her mind was occupied with immediate, practical concerns rather than the larger implications of Pemberton's unwelcome visit. But as she walked home through the gathering dusk, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted during that encounter. Pemberton's appearance had reminded her that her past was not as easily escaped as geographic distance might suggest, but Tom's intervention had shown her something else, that there were people in Pine Ridge who would stand with her, not because of her family name or social position, but simply because it was the right thing to do. For the first time since leaving Boston, Isabella began to wonder if she might have found not just a refuge from her old life, but the foundation for a new one. The encounter with Pemberton had shaken Isabella more than she cared to admit, not because his words carried any power to change her mind, but because they had forced her to confront the precarious nature of her newfound independence. That evening, she sat in her small cabin watching the fire crackle in the stone hearth, acutely aware of how quickly her carefully constructed peace could be disrupted by the intrusion of her former world. The mountains that had seemed like protective barriers now felt permeable, offering less sanctuary than she had hoped. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by dreams of Boston drawing rooms and the weight of expectation pressing down like a physical thing. When dawn finally broke over the eastern peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Isabella rose with the grim determination of someone who had decided to stop running from her problems and start facing them head-on. She dressed in her most practical clothes, braided her hair in a style that would stay neat through a day of hard work, and walked into town with a plan forming in her mind. Pine Ridge operated on rhythms entirely different from the structured social calendar that had governed her Boston life. Here, people rose with the sun and retired with its setting, their days shaped by practical necessities rather than social obligations. Isabella found Rose already at work in the bakery, preparing the day's bread while the ovens heated to their optimal temperature. The warm, yeast-scented air wrapped around Isabella like a welcoming embrace as she pushed through the door. "You're up early," Rose observed, looking up from the dough she was kneading with practiced efficiency. Most city folks take weeks to adjust to mountain time. Isabella tied an apron around her waist, a gesture that had become second nature during her weeks of learning the bakery's routines. "I've been thinking about what you said before, about proving myself to the community. I want to do more than just survive here, Rose. I want to belong." Rose's hands stilled in their work, and she studied Isabella with eyes that seemed to see straight through to the bone. "That fellow who came looking for you yesterday, he got you rattled?" The question was asked with characteristic mountain directness, no dancing around the subject or polite pretense that privacy might prevent honest conversation. Isabella found this refreshing after years of Boston's elaborate social codes where everything important was communicated through implication and subtext. "He reminded me that I can't just hide from my past indefinitely," Isabella admitted. "If I'm going to make a life here, it needs to be because I've chosen it, not because I'm running from something else." Rose nodded approvingly and resumed her kneading. "That's the first sensible thing I've heard you say since you arrived, if you don't mind my speaking plain. Folks here respect someone who stands their ground, but they don't have much use for people who are just passing through waiting for something better to come along." Over the following weeks, Isabella threw herself into mountain life with an intensity that surprised even her. She learned to split kindling with an axe that felt impossibly heavy at first, but gradually became manageable through repetition and developing muscle memory. She mastered the art of keeping her fire burning through the night, understanding finally why mountain people spoke of their woodpiles with the same reverence city dwellers reserve for their bank accounts. She taught herself to preserve vegetables from the small garden plot behind her cabin, following instructions from neighbors who shared their knowledge with the practical generosity that characterized mountain communities. Most importantly, she began to find ways to contribute skills that the community actually needed. Her education, which had seemed useless in the face of frontier practicalities, proved valuable in unexpected ways. When Daniel Crawford mentioned struggling with the bookkeeping for his store, Isabella volunteered to help organize his accounts, bringing order to ledgers that had been maintained with enthusiasm but little systematic method. When the schoolteacher fell ill with pneumonia, Isabella stepped in to teach the children, drawing on years of tutoring experience gained through her charitable work in Boston. The children of Pine Ridge were a revelation to Isabella. Unlike the carefully managed and supervised offspring of Boston's elite families, these mountain children possessed a freedom and self-reliance that amazed her. They thought nothing of walking miles through forest trails to reach the one-room schoolhouse, and they approached learning with a practical curiosity that made teaching them a joy rather than a duty. When young Sarah Crawford asked why she needed to learn about literature when she was planning to help run her father's store, Isabella found herself explaining how stories could help her understand the motivations and desires of customers, making her better at anticipating their needs and managing their accounts. It was during one of these teaching sessions that Isabella first noticed Mitchell observing her from the schoolhouse doorway. She had been working with the older students on a geography lesson, using maps to show them how Pine Ridge connected to the larger world beyond the mountains, when she became aware of his quiet presence. He stood in the doorway with the stillness that seemed to characterize all his movements, watching her explain trade routes and population centers with an attention that made her suddenly self-conscious about her animated gestures and enthusiastic tone. When the school day ended and the children scattered to their various homes and chores, Tom remained, leaning against the doorframe with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting for the right moment to speak. Isabella busied herself cleaning the blackboard and organizing papers, acutely aware of his presence but uncertain how to acknowledge it without appearing forward or presumptuous. "You're good with them," he said finally, his voice carrying the same quiet authority she remembered from their encounter at Crawford's store. "The children, I mean. They listen to you different than they listen to most adults." Isabella paused in her tidying, considering his observation. "I think they appreciate being treated like they have minds worth engaging rather than simply vessels to be filled with information. These children understand practical applications better than most adults I've taught." Tom stepped into the classroom properly, and Isabella noticed how his presence seemed to fill the space despite his understated manner. He moved to one of the student desks and examined the map she had used for the day's lesson, his calloused fingers tracing the routes she had shown the children. "You ever been to any of these places?" he asked, indicating the various cities and towns marked on the maps. "Some of them. Boston, of course, and New York, Philadelphia, a few others along the eastern seaboard. My family traveled when I was younger, though always in circumstances quite different from what most people experience." Isabella realized she was sharing more about her background than she had intended, but something about Tom's quiet attention made confidences feel natural rather than risky. Tom nodded without surprise, as if her privileged background was simply another fact to be filed away rather than judged. "What made you leave all that?" The question was asked without curiosity about scandal or drama, simply a straightforward inquiry that assumed she had good reasons for her choices. Isabella found herself wanting to give him an honest answer rather than the polite deflection she had perfected for other townspeople's inquiries. "I was suffocating," she said simply. "Not just from the expectations, though those were crushing enough, but from the feeling that my entire life had been planned out before I was old enough to have opinions about it. Every conversation, every social engagement, every relationship was evaluated based on how it served other people's goals for my future. I never had the chance to discover what I might want for myself." Tom listened without offering immediate responses or solutions, a quality Isabella had rarely encountered in her interactions with men. Most of the suitors who had called on her in Boston had treated her words as problems to be solved or opinions to be corrected, rather than thoughts worth considering on their own merits. "And what do you want for yourself?" he asked after a moment of comfortable silence. The question stopped Isabella short, because she realized she was still discovering the answer. "I want a matter," she said slowly, working through the thought as she spoke. "Not because of my family's money or social position, but because of what I can contribute through my own efforts. I want to wake up each morning knowing that my day will have purpose beyond ornamental function." Tom's gray eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. "Seems like you're well on your way to finding that here." Before Isabella could respond, the sound of voices from the street interrupted their conversation. Through the schoolhouse windows, they could see a small crowd gathering around a wagon that had just pulled up in front of Crawford's store. Tom moved to the window with the swift, economical motion that seemed to characterize all his actions. "That's the Hendersons' wagon," he said, his voice taking on a note of concern. "They shouldn't be coming to town this close to dark unless something's wrong." Isabella joined him at the window and saw a man helping a woman down from the wagon. seat while two small children huddled in the back among hastily packed belongings. Even from a distance, she could see the woman's distress and the man's grim expression as Daniel Crawford and several other townspeople hurried out to meet them. "We should see if they need help," Isabella said, already moving toward the door. Tom nodded approvingly. "That's what neighbors do around here." They walked quickly toward the growing crowd, and as they drew closer, Isabella could hear fragments of agitated conversation. The Hendersons, she learned, were homesteaders who lived in an isolated cabin about 15 miles up into the mountains. They had come to town because Mrs. Henderson had taken seriously ill, developing symptoms that her husband couldn't treat with their limited supplies and home remedies. "She's been burning with fever for 3 days now," John Henderson was explaining to Dr. Walsh, the town's only physician. "Started with what seemed like a simple cold, but then she couldn't keep any food down, and now she's talking out of her head half the time." Dr. Walsh examined Mrs. Henderson as best he could in the fading light, his weathered face grave with concern. "I need to get her somewhere warm and clean where I can treat her properly. The hotel won't do, not for something this serious." Isabella found herself speaking before she had fully considered the implications. "She can stay at my cabin. It's small, but it's clean and warm, and I can help care for her." The offer surprised even her with its spontaneity, but she realized immediately that it felt absolutely right. Here was a concrete way to contribute to her community, to prove that she belonged not through grand gestures, but through practical assistance when it was needed most. Dr. Walsh looked at her with new assessment. "That's generous of you, Miss Mitchell, but nursing someone this sick is demanding work. Are you prepared for what might be required?" "I helped care for my grandmother during her final illness," Isabella replied, drawing on memories she rarely allowed herself to revisit. "I understand what's involved." Tom stepped forward quietly. "I can help transport Mrs. Henderson to the cabin and assist with whatever else is needed." His offer of support made Isabella's chest tighten with gratitude. She was still learning to navigate the unspoken networks of mutual aid that held mountain communities together, and having someone with Tom's obvious competence and local respect backing, her offer gave it weight it might otherwise have lacked. The next several hours passed in a blur of practical activity. Mrs. Henderson was carefully transported to Isabella's cabin, where Dr. Walsh conducted a more thorough examination by lamplight. His diagnosis was pneumonia, complicated by exhaustion and malnutrition that had weakened her resistance to the infection. With proper care and rest, she would likely recover, but the process would require constant attention for at least a week. Isabella threw herself into the role of nurse with the same determination she had brought to learning mountain skills. She learned to prepare the herb-based remedies Dr. Walsh prescribed, to monitor Mrs. Henderson's breathing and temperature, and to coax small amounts of broth and water into someone too weak to sit up unassisted. It was exhausting, demanding work that left little time for sleep or attention to her own needs. Tom appeared each morning and evening without being asked, bringing fresh water from the well, splitting kindling for the fire, and handling the dozen small tasks that kept the household functioning while Isabella focused on patient care. He worked with quiet efficiency, never intrusive but somehow always present when his help was most needed. It was during the long nights of keeping vigil over Mrs. Henderson that Isabella began to understand something important about Tom Mitchell. He possessed a quality she had never encountered in the men of her Boston acquaintance, the ability to be fully present without demanding attention or recognition. When he sat reading by the fire while Isabella tended to her patient, his presence was soothing rather than distracting. When he prepared simple meals that allowed her to maintain her strength during the demanding days, he did so without expecting gratitude or praise. On the 4th night of Mrs. Henderson's illness, when the fever finally broke and her breathing began to ease, Isabella found herself sitting by the fire with Tom in the peaceful exhaustion that follows sustained crisis. Mrs. Henderson was sleeping. naturally for the first time since arriving, and the cabin felt infused with the quiet hope that comes when the worst danger has passed. "You saved her life," Tom said quietly, his voice carrying the same matter-of-fact tone he used for observations about weather or trail conditions. Isabella shook her head, suddenly feeling the weight of the past week's strain. "Dr. Walsh saved her life. I just followed his instructions." "Following instructions and caring for someone through pneumonia are two different things," Tom replied. "What you did required more than medical knowledge. It required the kind of commitment that comes from genuinely caring about people you barely know." The observation touched something deep in Isabella's chest, a recognition that her efforts had been seen and valued not for their social significance, but for their fundamental human worth. In Boston, her charitable work had been praised as appropriate activity for a woman of her station, but here in Pine Ridge, her care for Mrs. Henderson was appreciated simply because it had helped save a neighbor's life. "It felt right," she said simply. "For the first time since leaving Boston, I felt like I was doing something that truly mattered." Tom leaned forward slightly, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight as he studied her face. "You've been searching for where you belong." It wasn't a question, and Isabella found herself nodding even though she hadn't consciously articulated that goal to herself. "I think I have been. In Boston, I always felt like I was playing a role that never quite fit. Here, even when I'm struggling to learn new skills or failing at tasks that everyone else finds simple, I feel more like myself than I ever did in drawing rooms and ballrooms. Mountain living has a way of stripping away everything that isn't essential," Tom observed. "Out here, you find out pretty quick what you're really made of." Isabella considered this wisdom, recognizing its truth in her own experience. The months in Pine Ridge had indeed stripped away the elaborate social persona she had constructed. In Boston, revealing qualities she hadn't known she possessed: resilience, practical capability, and a capacity for genuine connection with people whose lives bore no resemblance to her privileged background. "What brought you to the mountains?" she asked, realizing that while Tom seemed to understand her journey clearly, she knew almost nothing about his own path to Pine Ridge. Tom's expression grew more guarded, though not unfriendly. "Similar reasons, I suppose. Needed to find out who I was when everything familiar got stripped away." Isabella sensed deeper currents in his carefully neutral response, experiences that had shaped him in ways that probably went beyond simple disillusionment with city life. She had learned enough about mountain community customs to know that personal privacy was respected absolutely, that people shared their stories when they chose to rather than when others were curious to hear them. "The war?" she asked gently, making it clear that he could ignore the question if he preferred. Tom nodded slowly. "Came back from France feeling like I didn't recognize the person I'd been before I left. Everything that had seemed important, meaningful, worthwhile, just felt hollow afterward. So I came west looking for something real. Did you find it?" Tom's smile was slight but genuine. "Starting to think I might have." The admission hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither was quite ready to address directly. Isabella felt something shift in her understanding of their developing friendship, a recognition that Tom's quiet attention to her well-being and gradual integration into the community might spring from motives more personal than simple neighborliness. Mrs. Henderson's recovery proceeded steadily over the following days, and as her strength returned, she began to share stories of homestead life that gave Isabella new appreciation for the challenges facing mountain families. The Hendersons had claimed their land under the Homestead Act, building their cabin and clearing their fields through backbreaking labor that left little margin for error or misfortune. Mrs. Henderson's illness had threatened not just her life, but the family's ability to complete the work required to prove their claim. "We've got until spring to get our improvements finished," John Henderson explained during one of his daily visits to check on his wife's progress. "If we can't prove we've been working the land properly, we'll lose everything we've built." "Isabella," found herself thinking about the Henderson family's situation long after their conversations ended. Here were people whose entire future depended on their ability to meet arbitrary deadlines imposed by distant bureaucrats, whose dreams of independence and self-sufficiency hung in the balance of their physical capacity to clear forest and plant crops before winter made further work impossible. It was Tom who suggested the solution that had been forming in Isabella's mind without her fully recognizing it. They were walking back from the Henderson homestead, where they had delivered supplies and checked on the family's progress, when he mentioned the community tradition of barn raisings and harvest cooperation. "Folks around here understand that. Everyone needs help sometimes," he said as they picked their way down the mountain trail in the gathering dusk. "The Hendersons have helped their neighbors plenty over the years. When spring comes, there'll be volunteers ready to help them finish their improvements." "But spring might be too late," Isabella replied. "The deadlines don't take mountain weather into account." Tom glanced at her with interest. "You thinking about organizing something before winter sets in?" Isabella realized that was exactly what she had been thinking, though she hadn't yet found words for the idea. "I have money," she said simply. "More than I could spend in a lifetime, certainly more than I need for my simple life here. If I hired men to help the Hendersons finish their improvements before the snow gets too deep, would that be appropriate? Or would it interfere with community traditions?" Tom stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his expression serious but not disapproving. "That's a generous thought, but you'd need to be careful about how you approached it. Mountain folks are proud, and they don't like charity that makes them feel diminished." "What if it wasn't charity?" Isabella asked, the idea crystallizing. As she spoke, "What if I hired the Hendersons to teach me homesteading skills while we worked on their improvements? I need to learn how to manage a larger property anyway if I'm going to stay here permanently. I could frame it as paying for education rather than offering assistance." Tom's slow smile told her she had found the right approach. "That might work, especially if you made it clear you were serious about learning, not just looking for a way to help without hurting their pride." The plan that emerged over the following weeks was more ambitious than Isabella had initially envisioned. Rather than simply hiring help for the Hendersons, she proposed to several families that she pay for expanded homestead improvements in exchange for comprehensive instruction in mountain farming, animal husbandry, and wilderness survival. The arrangement benefited everyone involved. The families received resources they needed to secure their claims. Isabella gained practical skills essential for permanent mountain residence, and the community saw concrete evidence of her commitment to making Pine Ridge her permanent home. The work began immediately, driven by the urgency of approaching winter and the recognition that spring deadlines wouldn't wait for convenient timing. Isabella threw herself into the physical labor with enthusiasm that surprised even her, learning to swing an axe effectively, to notch logs for cabin construction, and to prepare ground for spring planting. Her hands, already calloused from maintaining her own small homestead, developed new layers of roughness as she adapted to work that demanded strength and endurance she was still developing. Tom became her unofficial supervisor and primary instructor, teaching her techniques for efficient woodcutting, explaining the principles of log construction that would result in structures capable of withstanding mountain winters, and gradually sharing the accumulated wisdom that allowed people to thrive in environments that could kill the unprepared or careless. Working alongside him day after day, Isabella began to understand qualities in Tom that went beyond his obvious competence and quiet authority. He possessed an intuitive understanding of natural systems that allowed him to read weather patterns, animal behavior, and seasonal changes with accuracy that seemed almost supernatural to someone raised in urban environments. More importantly, he treated her efforts with respect even when her inexperience led to mistakes or inefficiencies. "You're learning faster than most folks who come to the mountains," he told her one afternoon as they worked together to raise the walls of an additional room on the Henderson cabin. Most city people expect the work to be easier than it is, or they give up when they realize how much they don't know. Isabella paused in her work to wipe sweat from her forehead, leaving a streak of dirt across her cheek that would have horrified her Boston social circle, but felt like a badge of honor in the mountain setting. I think I'm finally understanding what you meant about the mountain stripping away everything non-essential. This work doesn't care about my family name or social graces. It only cares about whether I can do what needs to be done. Tom set down his own tools and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You've changed since you first arrived in Pine Ridge. How so? When you stepped off that train, you carried yourself like someone who expected the world to accommodate her presence. Now you move like someone who's learned to accommodate herself to the world's demands. It's a good change. The observation resonated deeply with Isabella because she could feel the truth of it in her own body and mind. The woman who had rejected suitor after suitor in Boston drawing rooms had been protecting herself against a future that felt like surrender. The woman who now split logs and built cabin walls was actively creating a future that felt like freedom. As October deepened toward November and the first serious snows began to dust the higher peaks, Isabella realized that she had found something in Pine Ridge that had eluded her throughout her privileged Boston upbringing, a sense of purpose that arose from her own choices and efforts rather than other people's expectations. The work was hard, the conditions were often uncomfortable, and the margin for error was smaller than anything she had previously experienced. But for the first time in her adult life, she felt genuinely alive. The transformation was evident to everyone in the community, but perhaps most clearly to Tom, whose quiet attention had evolved into something deeper and more personal than simple neighborly concern. Isabella found herself increasingly aware of his presence, noticing the way he moved with unconscious grace despite his size, appreciating the dry humor that emerged during their long working days, and feeling grateful for his patient instruction in skills that were reshaping her understanding of her own capabilities. It was during one of their evening conversations, after a particularly satisfying day of completing the Henderson family's improvements ahead of schedule, that Isabella finally understood what was happening between them. They sat by her fireplace sharing a simple dinner, comfortable in the easy silence that had developed between them over weeks of shared work, when Tom made an observation that stopped her heart. "You know," he said quietly, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight as he looked at her across the small table, "I never thought I'd find peace again after the war. But working alongside you these past weeks, watching you discover who you really are when you're free to choose for yourself, it's reminded me that some things are worth believing in again." The admission was offered without expectation or demand, simply a sharing of truth between two people who had learned to trust each other through practical cooperation and growing mutual respect. Isabella felt something settle into place in her chest, a recognition that what she had been searching for in Pine Ridge wasn't just independence or purpose, but the possibility of connection with someone who saw her clearly and valued what he saw. The first heavy snowfall arrived 3 weeks earlier than anyone expected, blanketing Pine Ridge in 2 feet of pristine white that transformed the landscape into something from a fairy tale. Isabella woke to an unfamiliar silence, the kind of profound quiet that only comes when snow muffles every sound except the whisper of wind through pine boughs. She pushed open her cabin door to find a world remade, the familiar paths and landmarks erased beneath an unbroken expanse of white that sparkled like crushed diamonds in the morning sunlight. The early snow caught many of the homesteading families unprepared, their winter supplies still incomplete, and their livestock inadequately sheltered. Isabella had learned enough about mountain winters to understand the seriousness of the situation. What might be merely inconvenient in Boston could mean life or death in the isolated valleys and ridges surrounding Pine Ridge, where help was measured in days rather than hours, and survival depended entirely on individual preparation and community cooperation. Tom appeared at her door before she had finished her morning coffee, his boots leaving deep tracks through the unmarked snow that stretched between their properties. He carried snowshoes over his shoulder and wore the heavy wool coat and fur-lined gloves that marked him as someone who understood mountain weather intimately. His expression held the focused concern she had learned to associate with serious situations requiring immediate action. "We need to check on the outlying families," he said without preamble, stamping snow from his boots before entering the warmth of her cabin. "This much snow this early means some folks are going to be in trouble, especially the newer homesteaders who haven't had time to build proper winter preparations." Isabella was already reaching for her own heavy coat before he finished speaking. Over the months of working alongside mountain families, she had developed an instinctive understanding of the unspoken codes that govern frontier communities. When weather threatened, neighbors helped neighbors without question or calculation. Personal differences, social distinctions, and individual preferences all took second place to the fundamental imperative of keeping everyone alive through conditions that could kill the unprepared. They spent the day traversing snow-covered trails that led to isolated cabins scattered throughout the surrounding mountains. Isabella learned to navigate terrain that would have been challenging under ideal conditions, but became treacherous when landmarks disappeared beneath uniform white expanses. Tom moved through the winter landscape with the confidence of someone who could read subtle signs invisible to less experienced eyes, noting the direction of wind patterns, the depth of snow in sheltered areas, and the behavior of wildlife that indicated changing weather conditions. At the Morrison homestead, they found a family of 5 struggling to keep warm in a cabin whose chinking had failed, allowing bitter wind to penetrate walls that should have provided shelter. Tom and Isabella spent hours helping to repair the gaps with moss and clay, working by lamplight as the short winter day faded into early darkness. When they finally finished, the difference in temperature was immediately noticeable, and Mrs. Morrison's relief was evident in the tears that froze on her cheeks as she thanked them. The Kowalski cabin presented different challenges. The family had adequate shelter, but insufficient food to last through a winter that might stretch 6 months if the early snow indicated a harsh season ahead. Isabella found herself calculating the contents of her own carefully hoarded supplies, mentally redistributing resources to ensure that no family would face starvation during the months when hunting became impossible and supply trains couldn't reach Pine Ridge. It was at the Patterson place that they encountered the situation that would test everything Isabella had learned about mountain survival and community responsibility. The family consisted of an elderly man, his daughter-in-law, and 3 small children whose husband and father had left 2 weeks earlier to find work in the distant mining camps, promising to return before winter set in earnest. The early snow had trapped them in a cabin that was marginally adequate for autumn weather, but wholly insufficient for the bitter cold that would soon follow. "We can't wait for him to return," Tom said quietly as they assessed the family situation. The cabin's roof sagged under the weight of accumulated snow, the windows were covered with blankets rather than proper shutters, and the family's woodpile would last perhaps 2 weeks if carefully rationed. "This place won't survive a hard winter, and neither will they if we don't do something immediately." Isabella looked at the children huddled near their inadequate fire, their faces pinched with cold despite the heavy clothes they wore indoors, and felt something crystallize in her chest. Here was the moment when her commitment to mountain life would be tested not by her own comfort or convenience, but by her willingness to make sacrifices for people who had no claim on her beyond shared humanity and community membership. What would it take to make this place livable? She asked, already knowing the answer would require significant resources and considerable risk. Tom surveyed the cabin with the systematic attention of someone accustomed to evaluating structural problems. New roof, proper chinking, glass windows, better fireplace construction, and enough firewood to last until spring. The work could be done, but it would require materials we'd have to transport up here through snow that's only going to get deeper, and men willing to work in conditions that will be dangerous and miserable. How much would it cost? The question came out more bluntly than Isabella had intended, but Tom didn't seem surprised by her directness. He named a figure that represented a substantial portion of her carefully managed funds, money she had. Then, reserving for her own winter needs and the expansion of her property that she had planned for spring. Isabella considered the mathematics of survival with the same analytical approach she had once applied to charitable organizations in Boston, but the emotional equation was entirely different. In her former life, philanthropy had been an abstract exercise in social responsibility, writing checks to address problems she understood intellectually but had never experienced personally. Here, the faces of the Patterson children were specific and immediate, their need measurable in degrees of temperature and weeks of food supply. "Let's do it," she said simply, and watched Tom's expression shift from concern to something that might have been admiration. The work that followed tested every skill Isabella had acquired during her months in Pine Ridge, organizing the transportation of materials through increasingly difficult conditions required the kind of logistical planning she had once applied to Boston charity events, but with stakes measured in human lives rather than social success. She learned to negotiate with suppliers who were reluctant to risk their own safety for uncertain profit, to coordinate volunteer labor among men whose own families needed attention, and to maintain morale during work that was physically exhausting and emotionally demanding. Tom became her partner in the effort in ways that went beyond mere cooperation. He understood the technical requirements of the construction work, but more importantly, he possessed the respect within the community that made other men willing to follow his lead even when conditions became dangerous. Isabella found herself relying on his judgment, not just about practical matters, but about the complex social dynamics that determined whether their efforts would succeed or fail. Working together day after day in conditions that stripped away every pretense except competence and character, Isabella began to understand that what had developed between them was unlike any relationship she had experienced in her carefully managed Boston social life. Tom treated her as an equal partner in decision-making, valuing her organizational skills and financial resources, while expecting her to contribute physical labor and accept personal risk alongside everyone else involved in the project. The transformation of the Patterson cabin took 3 weeks of backbreaking work conducted in weather that grew progressively worse as November advanced toward December. Isabella learned to work effectively while wearing the heavy gloves and layers of clothing that mountain winter demanded, to maintain focus and energy despite the abbreviated daylight that limited productive hours, and to find satisfaction in incremental progress that accumulated into substantial achievement. When the new roof was finally completed and the last chinking sealed against winter wind, Isabella stood inside the transformed cabin, feeling a satisfaction unlike anything she had experienced during her years of Boston social achievement. The Patterson children played near a fireplace that would keep them warm through the coldest nights. Their mother moved efficiently through a space that would protect rather than endanger her family, and the elderly grandfather nodded his approval of work that met mountain standards for durability and craftsmanship. "You saved our lives," Mrs. Patterson said as Isabella prepared to leave, her words carrying the simple directness that characterized mountain communication. "I don't know how we can ever repay such kindness." Isabella realized that she had learned something fundamental about the difference between charity and community responsibility. In Boston, her philanthropic efforts had been praised as evidence of proper social conscience, but the recipients of her assistance had remained distant, figures whose gratitude was expressed through formal letters rather than personal connection. Here, she had worked alongside the people she was helping, sharing risk and effort in ways that created bonds of mutual respect rather than mere obligation. The return journey to her own cabin took place in the early darkness of a December evening, when the temperature dropped so quickly that their breath formed clouds of vapor that froze almost instantly. Tom walked beside her through snow that crunched beneath their feet with the distinctive sound of extreme cold. The familiar trail transformed into a landscape that required constant attention to avoid dangerous missteps. "You've found your place." "Here," Tom said as they paused to rest halfway down the mountain, his words visible as white puffs in the frigid air. "When you first arrived, you were running from something that didn't fit. Now you're running towards something that does." Isabella considered his observation while catching her breath in air so cold it made her lungs ache. He was right about the fundamental change in her motivation and direction, but she realized there was something else that had shifted during her months in Pine Ridge, something that had crystallized during the weeks of working to save the Patterson family. "I think I understand now what I was really searching for," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "It wasn't just independence or purpose, though those were important. I was looking for someone who could see me as I really am rather than as a symbol of something else." Tom's gray eyes reflected the starlight that illuminated the snow-covered landscape around them, and Isabella saw something in his expression that made her heart begin beating faster despite the cold that should have slowed all bodily functions. "And what do you see when you look at yourself now?" he asked quietly. Isabella thought about the woman who had stepped off the train in Pine Ridge months earlier, desperate to escape a life that felt like suffocation, and compared her to the person she had become through months of physical labor, community involvement, and the gradual stripping away of social pretenses that had once defined her identity. "I see someone who can be trusted with important work," she said slowly, working through the thought as she spoke. "Someone who doesn't break when things get difficult. Someone who can be depended on when other people need help. I see someone who belongs somewhere not because of what she was born with, but because of what she's chosen to do." Tom stepped closer to her, close enough that she could see the frost on his breath and the serious intensity in his expression. "I see all of that," he said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had attracted her attention from their first meeting. "But I also see something else. I see someone who's taught me that it's possible to find peace after believing it was lost forever." The admission hung in the cold air between them, carrying implications that Isabella had been sensing but not quite ready to acknowledge. During the months of working together, learning from each other, and gradually building the kind of trust that could only develop through shared challenges and mutual dependence, something had grown between them that transcended simple friendship or even romantic attraction. "Tom," she began, but he held up a gloved hand to stop her. "Before you say anything, there's something you need to know about me," he said, his voice taking on the careful tone of someone preparing to share information that might change everything. "Something I should have told you before now, but I wasn't sure how, or if it would matter." Isabella felt a flutter of uncertainty in her chest, wondering what revelation could be serious enough to require such careful introduction. During their months of working together, she had come to trust Tom's character and judgment so completely that she couldn't imagine any disclosure that would fundamentally alter her opinion of him. "The war changed me in ways that go beyond what most people understand," Tom continued, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance rather than meeting her gaze directly. "I came back from France with injuries that don't show, wounds that affect how I relate to people and situations. Sometimes I have episodes where the memories take over, where I'm not entirely present in the current moment. It's part of why I chose to live alone, why I wasn't sure I could ever be the kind of partner someone like you deserves." Isabella felt something shift in her understanding of Tom's careful solitude and measured interactions with others. She had attributed his preference for isolation to the same desire for independence that had driven her own flight from Boston. But now she realized that his retreat to the mountains had been motivated by considerations more complex and painful than simple disillusionment with urban life. "How bad are these episodes?" she asked, her voice carrying practical concern rather than sympathy or alarm. Tom's slight smile suggested he appreciated her direct approach to what could have been an awkward conversation. They've gotten less frequent and less severe since I've been in the mountains. The work, the routine, the sense of purpose I've found here, all of that helps. But they still happen, especially when I'm under stress or when something triggers memories I can't control. Isabella considered this information with the same analytical approach she had learned to apply to mountain survival challenges. Tom's honesty about his limitations was itself evidence of the character that had attracted her respect and growing affection. A man who could acknowledge his vulnerabilities while continuing to function effectively and help others was demonstrating exactly the kind of strength she had learned to value during her time in Pine Ridge. "Is that why you're telling me now?" she asked. "Because you're worried that what's developing between us might trigger more episodes?" Tom's gray eyes finally met hers directly, and she saw vulnerability there that was more intimate than any physical contact they had shared. "I'm telling you because I realized tonight, watching you work to save the Patterson family, that I want to build something with you that goes beyond the friendship we've developed. But I can't ask you to take on that kind of uncertainty without knowing what you might be getting into." Isabella felt her heart begin to race as the implications of his words settled into full understanding. Here was the moment she had been unconsciously working toward since her first day in Pine Ridge, the opportunity to choose not just a place to belong but a person to belong with. The decision would determine not just her immediate future, but the entire trajectory of the life she was building in the mountains. She stepped closer to Tom, close enough to see the frost on his eyelashes and the careful hope in his expression. "Do you remember what you told me about the mountains stripping away everything that isn't essential?" Tom nodded, clearly uncertain where her comment was leading. "What I've learned about myself over these months is that I don't need guarantees or perfect circumstances to be happy," Isabella continued, her voice gaining strength as she worked through the thought. "What I need is someone who sees me clearly, who trusts me with important work, and who isn't afraid to share his own struggles and uncertainties. You've shown me all of that and more." Before Tom could respond, Isabella moved closer still, until only inches separated them in the cold mountain air. "There's something I need to tell you too. Something I probably should have said weeks ago, but wasn't sure how to put into words." Tom waited with the patient attention that characterized all his interactions, giving her space to find the language for whatever she needed to express. "I love you," Isabella said simply, the words carrying clearly in the crystalline air. "Not because you're perfect or because you can solve all my problems, but because you've shown me what it means to be truly seen and valued for who I am rather than what I represent. I love your competence and your gentleness and your willingness to help people even when it costs you something significant. I love the way you've taught me things I never knew I needed to learn, and the way you've trusted me with work that matters." Tom's expression transformed as her words registered, the careful guardedness replaced by something that looked like wonder. "Isabella," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I've been afraid to hope for something like this. After the war, after everything that got broken inside me, I convinced myself that the best I could manage was solitude and useful work. I never imagined finding someone who could make me believe in the possibility of happiness again." Instead of responding with words, Isabella reached up and placed her gloved hands on either side of Tom's face, drawing him down until their foreheads touched. In that moment of connection, with their breath mingling in clouds of white vapor, and the vast silence of the mountain winter surrounding them, she felt the last piece of her new identity click into place. "Tom," she whispered, her voice carrying all the certainty she had been building through months of challenging work and gradual self-discovery. "Yes?" He breathed, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her feel completely seen and understood. Isabella smiled, thinking of all the complicated explanations and lengthy declarations that had characterized romantic moments in her Boston social circle, then chose the simplicity that she had learned to value in mountain communication. "Home," she said, speaking the single word that encompassed everything she had discovered about belonging, purpose, and the possibility of love that enhanced rather than diminished individual strength. Tom's smile began slowly and built until it transformed his entire face, erasing the careful control he usually maintained and revealing joy that was as bright and clean as the snow-covered landscape around them. Home, he repeated, making the word both agreement and promise. When he kissed her, it was with the same patient thoroughness he brought to all-important work, and Isabella felt herself responding with the complete trust she had learned to place in his competence and character. The kiss lasted until the cold began to penetrate even their heavy winter clothing, but the warmth that spread through Isabella's chest had nothing to do with physical temperature and everything to do with the recognition that she had found exactly what she hadn't known she was searching for. They walked the rest of the way to Isabella's cabin hand in hand, moving through snow that sparkled like scattered stars under the clear mountain sky. Behind them, their tracks marked a path that connected Tom's solitary homestead to Isabella's carefully tended property, creating a visible symbol of the bridge they were building between two lives that had both been shaped by the healing power of chosen solitude and meaningful work. Inside the warmth of Isabella's cabin, they sat by the fire that had become the center of her domestic life, sharing the simple meal she prepared while Tom added logs to maintain the steady heat that would carry them through the cold night ahead. The conversation that followed covered practical matters like winter preparations and spring planning, but underlying every discussion of crops and construction was the understanding that they were now planning together, rather than as separate individuals managing adjacent properties. "There's something I want to ask you," Tom said as the evening drew toward its close, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone approaching a subject of particular importance. Isabella looked up from the sewing that occupied her hands during quiet evening hours, her attention focused entirely on whatever he needed to say. "When spring comes, when travel becomes possible again, your family will probably send someone else to retrieve you. Someone with more authority or different arguments than Pemberton brought. Are you prepared for that confrontation?" The question was both practical and profound, addressing not just the logistics of maintaining her chosen independence but her emotional readiness to definitively close the door on her former life. Isabella considered her response carefully, wanting to give Tom the honest assessment he deserved rather than empty reassurance. "I think I am," she said slowly, setting down her needlework to give the conversation her full attention. "When Pemberton appeared, I was still partly defined by what I was running from. Now I'm defined by what I've chosen to build. If my family sends representatives, they'll be trying to reclaim someone who no longer exists." Tom nodded approvingly. "And if they threaten to cut off your inheritance or disown you entirely?" Isabella had been expecting this question and had already worked through the financial implications of permanent estrangement from her family's wealth. "I have enough money under my own control to live comfortably for the rest of my life, especially if I continue to live simply as I've learned to do here. More importantly, I've discovered that I can support myself through my own work, if necessary. I'm not the helpless ornament I was raised to be. And if they argue that you're throwing away opportunities for a larger life, more influence, the chance to make a difference in the world." This question struck closer to Isabella's remaining uncertainties, touching on the part of her that sometimes wondered whether her retreat to mountain isolation represented wisdom or self-indulgence. She had been raised to believe that privilege carried responsibility, that her advantages should be used in service of broader social good rather than personal satisfaction. "I've thought about that," she admitted. "But what I've learned here is that there are many ways to make a difference in the world. The work I've done with the homesteading families, the connections I've built in this community, the example I've set of a woman choosing her own path, all of that matters too. Maybe not on the same scale as the charitable organizations I supported in Boston, but perhaps more authentically." Tom reached across the small space between their chairs and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against her increasingly rough skin. "I think you've found your answer then. The woman who saved the Patterson family's life and helped half a dozen homesteaders secure their claims isn't someone who's withdrawn from making a difference in the world. She's someone who's found a different way to do it." Isabella felt the truth of his observation settle into her bones with the satisfaction of a puzzle piece finding its proper place. She had indeed found a different way to live meaningfully, one that integrated personal fulfillment with genuine service to others in a manner that her Boston life had never achieved. "There's one more thing," Tom said, his voice taking on a note of nervous determination that was uncharacteristic of his usual calm confidence. "Something I've been wanting to say since we walked home tonight, but I wanted to make sure I said it properly." Isabella felt her heartbeat quicken with anticipation, sensing that whatever Tom needed to express would mark another significant moment in the transformation of their relationship. "Isabella," he began, then paused and started again with visible effort. "When I came to these mountains, I thought I was looking for solitude and the chance to heal without having to explain myself to anyone. What I found instead was the possibility of building something better than what I'd lost, something that incorporates the lessons I've learned without being defined entirely by them." He paused again, and Isabella waited with the patience she had learned from mountain life, giving him space to find the words for whatever he needed to communicate. "I want to ask you to marry me," Tom said finally, his gray eyes holding hers with steady intensity. "Not because either of us needs rescuing or completing, but because what we've built together is stronger and more meaningful than what either of us could create alone. I want to wake up every morning knowing that we're partners in whatever challenges and joys the mountains send our way." Isabella felt tears begin to gather in her eyes, not from sadness or uncertainty, but from the overwhelming recognition that Tom had found exactly the right words to express what marriage could mean between two people who had both learned to stand on their own before choosing to stand together. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying the same certainty she had felt when she decided to leave Boston months earlier. "Yes, because you've shown me what it means to be loved for who I am rather than what I might become. Yes, because we've already proven we can work together through difficult circumstances. Yes, because I can't imagine building the rest of my life with anyone else." Tom's smile was brilliant in the firelight as he leaned forward to kiss her again, this time with the knowledge that they were sealing not just a romantic commitment, but a practical partnership that would shape every aspect of their mountain life together. Later, as Isabella prepared for sleep in her small cabin, while Tom returned to his own homestead through the cold night air, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from the suffocating privilege of Boston society to this moment of clear-eyed happiness in the Colorado mountains. She had indeed found what she had been searching for without knowing its name, a place where she belonged not because of circumstances of birth, but because of choices deliberately made, work consciously undertaken, and love freely given and received. Outside her windows, the snow continued to fall in the profound silence of mountain winter, adding layers to the white expanse that would keep Pine Ridge isolated from the outside world until spring's arrival made travel possible again. But Isabella no longer thought of the isolation as temporary refuge from a life she was avoiding. Instead, she understood it as the protective embrace of a community she had chosen and been chosen by, a home that would support and challenge her in equal measure for all the years to come. When spring finally arrived and the inevitable representatives from her Boston family made their appearance in Pine Ridge, they would find not the frightened young woman who had fled their expectations, but a confident mountain wife whose life was built on foundations of mutual respect, shared work, and love that had been tested by genuine hardship and proven stronger than mere convenience or social compatibility. Isabella fell asleep that night with Tom's word echoing in her mind like a promise and a prayer. Home. She had finally found it. Not in a place or a position, but in the recognition that she was exactly where and with whom she belonged. The mountain. Spring arrived with breathtaking intensity, transforming Pine Ridge from winter's stark beauty into an explosion of wildflowers and rushing streams. Isabella stood outside the cabin she now shared with Tom, breathing air that carried promises of warmth and new growth. They had married during February's deepest cold, exchanging vows in Rose's bakery while a blizzard raged outside, surrounded by their chosen community rather than distant family obligations. Tom appeared on the horizon, returning from his morning patrol of their expanded homestead. Even at a distance, Isabella could read the tension in his movements, the alert posture that meant trouble was approaching their carefully constructed sanctuary. "Riders coming up the valley," Tom announced as he reached her, his voice carrying controlled concern. 3 men, well-dressed, riding expensive horses. "They'll reach town within the hour." Isabella's stomach tightened with familiar dread. She had been expecting this confrontation since Pemberton's failed attempt to retrieve her last autumn. Her family would never simply accept her transformation into a mountain wife. These riders represented a more serious effort to reclaim what the Hayes family considered their wayward daughter. "I should meet them in town," Isabella said, already reaching for her practical dress and sturdy boots. "Whatever they're planning, it's better if I face them directly." Tom nodded approvingly. "I'll come with you. Not to speak for you, but to make sure they understand you're not alone here." They walked into Pine Ridge together, moving with the measured pace that mountain people used for covering distance efficiently. Isabella found herself noticing details with heightened awareness, sunlight filtering through pine needles, the sound of snowmelt creating temporary streams, bird calls announcing the return of spring migrants. The 3 riders had gathered outside Crawford's general store, their expensive clothes and urban bearing marking them as completely foreign to Pine Ridge's practical community. Isabella recognized the leader immediately, Jonathan Hayes, her father's brother, chosen for missions requiring both diplomacy and determination. The second man appeared military-trained but civilian-dressed, suggesting her family was taking the possibility of resistance seriously. The third was elderly and scholarly, carrying a leather satchel that probably contained legal documents intended to provide official weight to whatever ultimatums they had prepared. "Miss Isabella," Jonathan called out as he spotted her approach, relief evident in his voice. "Thank goodness we found you safe. Your mother has been beside herself with worry." The greeting was calculated to establish both familial connection and moral obligation, positioning Isabella as a beloved family member whose absence had caused genuine suffering rather than a rebellious adult whose choices deserved respect. "Uncle Jonathan," Isabella replied politely but without warmth, "I'm surprised to see you so far from Boston." "Difficult but necessary, my dear," Jonathan responded, his eyes taking in her work-roughened hands and the obvious changes that mountain life had wrought. "We've come to discuss your situation and explore options for resolving what has become a complicated family matter." Isabella noticed he avoided using her married name, despite the wedding ring clearly visible on her hand and Tom's obvious presence. This omission was deliberate, part of a strategy to avoid acknowledging commitments that would complicate their efforts. "There's nothing complicated about my situation," Isabella said calmly. "I'm married, and my husband and I have built a successful life here. I'm quite content with my choices." Tom stepped forward slightly, extending his hand with mountain directness. "Thomas Mitchell, Isabella's husband. Pleased to meet her family, though I wish circumstances were more cordial." Jonathan hesitated before accepting the handshake, clearly evaluating whether acknowledging the marriage would undermine his mission. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm sure you're decent, but surely you understand that a marriage entered into under such irregular circumstances raises questions about validity." The comment was designed to plant doubt about Isabella's choices while avoiding direct insult. It was precisely the sophisticated manipulation that had driven her to flee Boston originally. The only irregular circumstance was Isabella choosing to marry someone who loves her for herself rather than her inheritance. Tom replied calmly, but with an edge. Around here, that's considered the most sensible reason for marriage. Perhaps we could continue this privately, the scholarly man interjected. I'm Charles Whitman, the family's legal representative, with documents that might clarify some issues. Isabella recognized the attempt to separate her from community support, isolating her from the social context that had given her strength during her transformation. This conversation is fine where it is, Isabella said firmly. Pine Ridge is my home. These people are my community. I have nothing to hide from them. Jonathan's expression grew serious as he realized Isabella wouldn't be easily separated from her support system. Isabella, your father's health has declined significantly since your departure. Your continued absence is affecting his business, relationships in ways that have practical consequences for the entire family. The revelation about her father's health struck like a physical blow, hitting exactly the vulnerability her family would have calculated most effective. She had always been close to her father, and the thought that her absence might be contributing to illness created immediate guilt. Tom moved closer, offering support without interfering. His presence reminded Isabella she was no longer the isolated woman who had fled Boston, but a partner in a marriage built on mutual respect. I'm sorry about Father's illness, Isabella said carefully, maintaining composure. But I find it difficult to believe my marriage and Colorado residency are primary factors affecting his health or business. Whitman produced a document from his satchel. Your father's will designates you as heir to substantial estate portions. But your legal status has become ambiguous due to irregular marriage and residence outside Massachusetts jurisdiction. This uncertainty affects his business commitments and financial planning. Isabella realized her family's concern was primarily financial, rooted in complicated legal implications of an heiress who had removed herself from their control. Her inheritance represented not just personal wealth, but collateral for business ventures and social connections. So this visit is less about my welfare and more about resolving legal complications my absence created for family business interests, Isabella observed analytically. Jonathan looked uncomfortable at having his motivations exposed. Your welfare and family business interests aren't mutually exclusive. We want what's best for you, but we have responsibilities to other family members affected by this situation. What exactly are you proposing? Isabella asked. Whitman stepped forward, clearly prepared. We're offering compromise that acknowledges your independence desire while addressing family concerns. You'd return to Boston for an extended visit, during which your marriage could be quietly annulled on irregular circumstances grounds. In exchange, you'd receive immediate access to substantial trust funds allowing independent living without family interference. The offer was sophisticated, acknowledging her autonomy, while attempting to achieve family goals through financial incentive rather than direct coercion. And if I refuse this generous compromise, then your inheritance would need restructuring to reflect apparent abandonment of family responsibilities, Whitman replied clinically. Your father's will would be modified to ensure family assets remain within family control. Isabella felt familiar anger, but this time tempered by confidence gained through mountain life. Her family was using financial pressure to force compliance, treating her autonomy as a problem to be solved. Uncle Jonathan, do you actually know anything about the life I've built here? Have you made any effort to understand what I've accomplished or why I've chosen to stay? Jonathan's hesitation suggested his knowledge was limited to investigation and reports rather than genuine interest. I've helped save families from winter, starvation. I've taught children whose parents build futures with their hands rather than inherited wealth. I've learned skills that make me genuinely useful rather than ornamental. I've married a man who sees me as a partner rather than a prize. Isabella's voice grew stronger. I've discovered I'm capable of building meaningful life based on my own choices rather than other people's expectations. Why would I abandon that to return to a world where my value is measured by compliance with others' plans? Tom chose that Moment to speak with quiet authority. You gentlemen need to understand something about mountain communities. We measure success by character, competence, and community contribution. By those standards, your niece has become one of Pine Ridge's most respected members. You're asking her to abandon not just home and husband, but an entire identity earned through her own efforts. Jonathan looked around at gathering townspeople, realizing Isabella wasn't an isolated individual who could be pressured, but a valued community member whose choices would be supported. "Isabella," he said finally, more conciliatory, "I can see you found satisfaction here. But please consider broader implications, particularly for your father's health and family stability." Isabella considered her response carefully, recognizing this moment would determine her relationship with her birth family for years to come. "Uncle Jonathan, I understand my absence created complications, and I'm genuinely sorry about Father's illness. But I cannot return to a life requiring me to surrender autonomy and identity I've worked to build. If family financial arrangements cannot accommodate a daughter who chose independence over compliance, then those arrangements need modification." She gathered thoughts for her final statement. "I love my family, but I love myself enough to refuse sacrificing happiness and self-respect for your convenience. My home is here, my husband is here, my work is here, my future is here. That's not temporary or a phase. It's permanent choice made by an adult woman with the right to determine her own path." As the three men mounted horses and prepared to leave, Isabella felt finality settling over the confrontation. She had chosen not from emotional reaction, but careful consideration of all factors, including genuine costs her decision imposed. Tom took her hand as they watched riders disappear down the valley. "Any regrets?" Isabella considered honestly, thinking about the father whose illness she might never ease, the inheritance formally abandoned, the social world permanently closed to her. Then she looked at the mountain community that had become home, the cabin she and Tom built together, the future they would create through their own efforts. "None," she said with certainty. "Absolutely none." That evening, sitting by their fireplace, Isabella reflected on the journey from Boston's suffocating privilege to this moment of clear-eyed contentment. She had learned true independence was an absence of connection, but freedom to choose connections based on mutual respect rather than social obligation. "Thank you for standing with me today," she told Tom. "Not just offering support, but trusting me to handle the situation while making clear I wasn't alone." Tom smiled, transforming his weathered features with warmth. "That's what partners do. We stand together when things get difficult, and trust each other to be strong enough for whatever comes." As Isabella settled into his arms beside the crackling fire, listening to mountain night sounds that had become their shared life soundtrack, she thought about the single word that had become foundation of everything meaningful: home. Not a place or position, but recognition that she was exactly where and with whom she belonged. In the morning, she would wake to another day of meaningful work, genuine partnership, and deep satisfaction from living according to her own values. She would continue building the life she had chosen, one day at a time, surrounded by people who valued her for who she was rather than what she represented. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.